The moment Marcus slammed his laptop shut and looked me dead in the eye, I knew something fundamental had shifted. "You're just not good enough, Sarah," he said, his voice carrying that particular blend of condescension and finality that I'd grown to recognize over the past 3 years. "Maybe it's time you accepted that and found something more suitable to your capabilities." The conference room fell silent. 6 other executives sat frozen around the mahogany table, their eyes darting between us like spectators at a tennis match. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of TechFlow Solutions headquarters, the Seattle skyline glittered in the afternoon sun, oblivious to the fact that my world had just imploded. The silence stretched until it became suffocating, broken only by the distant hum of the building's air conditioning system and the muffled sounds of traffic 30 floors below. But let me back up, because this crystalline moment of absolute clarity, didn't happen in a vacuum. It was the culmination of 1,000 smaller cruelties, a systematic erosion of my confidence that had been orchestrated by the man I'd once trusted with my heart, my future, and my career. It was the final stroke in a masterpiece of manipulation that had taken 3 years to complete. 3 years earlier, I'd been a different person entirely. Fresh out of MIT with dual degrees in computer science and business administration, summa cum laude, with a thesis on machine learning optimization that my professors had called groundbreaking. I'd been recruited by half a dozen Fortune 500 companies, each offering packages that would have set me up for life before I turned 25. Google wanted me for their AI division. Microsoft was courting me for their cloud infrastructure team. Amazon had made an offer that included stock options that could have made me a millionaire within 5 years. But when Marcus Chen, charismatic, brilliant, and devastatingly handsome, had offered me a position as lead developer at his startup, I'd said yes without hesitation. Not just to the job, but to him. We'd met at a tech conference in San Francisco, where I'd been presenting my research on predictive analytics. He'd approached me after my presentation, his dark eyes bright with what I'd thought was genuine admiration. "That was incredible," he'd said, his smile warm and engaging. "I've never seen someone explain neural network optimization in terms that made it feel like poetry." I'd been smitten immediately. Marcus had a way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room, like your thoughts and ideas were the most fascinating things he'd ever encountered. Within an hour, we were having coffee in the hotel lobby, talking about everything from quantum computing to our shared love of obscure science fiction novels. Within 6 months, we were living together in his Pike Place penthouse, building what we called our empire by day and planning our future by night. Those early days felt magical. We'd work side by side in his home office, 2 brilliant minds tackling complex problems together. I'd code while he handled business development, but the boundaries were fluid. He'd ask for my input on investor presentations, and I'd help him refine his vision for the company. TechFlow Solutions had been his brainchild, a cloud-based project management platform that promised to revolutionize how small businesses operated. But the technical architecture, the algorithms that made it work, the elegant solutions to complex scalability problems, those were mine. I'd spent countless nights perfecting the machine learning components that could predict project timelines, identify potential bottlenecks, and optimize resource allocation. My neural network design was revolutionary, capable of learning from user behavior patterns in ways that existing platforms couldn't match. The code was elegant, efficient, and scalable, a work of art that could handle millions of users without breaking a sweat. Marcus would watch me work with what I thought was love and admiration. "You're incredible," he'd whisper, massaging my shoulders as I debugged late into the night. "I can't believe someone as brilliant as you chose to be with someone like me." I should have paid more attention to that last part. TechFlow's initial success was meteoric. Within 6 months, we had our first round of funding. Within a year, we were processing hundreds of thousands of transactions daily. Tech blogs were calling us the next big thing in project management. But somewhere along the way, as investor meetings replaced our late-night coding sessions and Marcus's ego inflated with each round of funding, I'd been gradually pushed to the margins of my own creation. It started so subtly that I didn't notice it at first. In those early days when investors would visit, Marcus would introduce me as my developer girlfriend, rather than my co-founder, or even just our lead developer. When I'd try to correct him, he'd laugh it off with that charming smile that had first captivated me. You know how these old boys clubs work, babe, he'd say, pulling me close after the investors had left. They're not ready for a woman to be taken seriously in a technical leadership role. We need to play the game until we're established enough to make our own rules. I'd bought that explanation completely. After all, I'd experienced enough sexism in tech to know he wasn't wrong about the industry's biases. I told myself he was protecting me, that once we were successful enough, he'd give me the recognition I deserved. I was naive enough to believe that love meant putting the person you cared about in a position to succeed, even if it meant temporarily diminishing their public role. The first board meeting where I wasn't invited should have been my wake-up call. It's just boring financial stuff, Marcus had assured me, kissing my forehead like I was a child being dismissed from adult conversation. You hate those spreadsheet discussions anyway. Focus on what you do best, making our platform incredible. I'd found out later, through overheard conversations and glimpses of meeting notes left carelessly on his desk, that they'd discussed implementing my machine learning optimization algorithm, the one I'd developed in my spare time to solve TechFlow's most persistent performance issues, without crediting me or offering additional compensation. When I confronted Marcus about it, he'd looked genuinely confused. But Sarah, your work is TechFlow's work. We're partners in this. What's good for the company is good for both of us. He'd taken my hands in his thumb tracing circles on my palm in that way that used to make my heart race. Besides, the algorithm wouldn't exist without the platform I created for it to run on. We're a team. The gaslighting was so subtle, so perfectly executed that I'd actually apologize for bringing it up. The pattern escalated from there. My ideas would disappear from our shared documents, only to reappear in Marcus's presentations to clients, polished and reframed as his innovations. When I'd confront him privately, he'd act bewildered, his brown eyes wide with what I now recognize as manufactured innocence. I thought we agreed that all our work was collaborative, he'd say, his voice carrying just the right note of hurt confusion. Isn't this what couples do? Share everything? I mean, I share all my business insights with you. I thought you understood that we're building this together. It was masterful, really. He'd make me feel selfish for wanting individual recognition, small and petty for caring about credit when we were supposedly working toward a shared goal. Every time I tried to assert myself, he'd reframe it as a relationship problem rather than a professional one. At home, the dynamic was equally toxic, though I didn't recognize it then. Marcus had a gift for making his criticisms sound like loving concern. When I'd suggest new features for the platform, he'd nod thoughtfully, his head tilted in that way that made him look incredibly handsome and deeply contemplative. Then he'd explain, always in that patient tone reserved for explaining complex concepts to children, why my ideas wouldn't work. You're thinking like a developer, not a CEO, he'd say, his hand resting gently on my knee. That's why I handle the business side. You're brilliant at solving technical problems, but you don't understand market dynamics the way I do. When I'd push back, citing market research I'd done or user feedback I'd gathered, he'd sigh and pull me close. Babe, I love how passionate you are about this. But trust me, I've been studying business strategy since I was 12. My father didn't build a tech empire by listening to engineers who thought they understood markets. The mention of his father was always the conversation ender. Marcus's father had indeed built a successful tech company in the early days of the internet, and Marcus had grown up in boardrooms and at networking events. I'd grown up in my parents' academic offices, surrounded by books and research papers. The implication was clear. He was born for this world while I was just visiting. The worst part was how he'd undermine my confidence in public settings. At company parties, client dinners, and industry events, Marcus would regale everyone with stories about my cute coding mistakes, or how I'd once stayed up all night debugging a problem that any senior developer would have caught immediately. He'd frame these stories as endearing, his arm around my waist as he spoke, his voice warm with what sounded like affection. Sarah's incredible, don't get me wrong, he'd say to a room full of potential clients or investors. She can code circles around most people, but she has this adorable habit of overthinking simple problems. Last week, she spent 6 hours tracking down a bug that turned out to be a missing semicolon. The room would laugh, and Marcus would squeeze my waist as if to say, "Isn't she precious?" but I could see the way our colleagues' eyes would shift, their respect for my technical abilities dimming with each anecdote. I could feel myself shrinking in their estimation, becoming not the brilliant developer who'd built TechFlow's core architecture, but Marcus's quirky girlfriend who was pretty good with computers. The most insidious part was how he'd mix these undermining stories with just enough genuine praise to keep me off balance. Of course, none of our success would be possible without Sarah's incredible technical foundation, he'd add, just when I thought I might finally speak up. She's the best developer I've ever worked with. I'm so lucky to have her on my team. On my team, not as my partner, not as my co-founder. On his team, like I was an employee, he was graciously acknowledging. Meanwhile, TechFlow was thriving beyond our wildest early projections. The platform I'd architected was processing millions of transactions monthly, handling loads that should have required massive infrastructure overhauls. My original code was so elegantly designed that we'd barely needed to modify the core systems as we scaled from hundreds to hundreds of thousands of users. The machine learning algorithms I'd developed were providing insights that our competitors couldn't match, giving us a significant edge in user retention and satisfaction. Industry publications were calling TechFlow revolutionary and the future of project management. But Marcus was now the sole face of the company, gracing magazine covers and speaking at conferences about his vision and his innovation. When journalists would ask about his technical team, he'd mention brilliant developers in general terms, never naming anyone specifically. I'd become a footnote in my own story, invisible despite being the architect of everything that made TechFlow special. The breaking point should have come 8 months ago, when Marcus announced he was bringing in a real CTO. A Harvard MBA named Derek Hoffman with half my technical experience, but the right pedigree and network connections. Derek had never written a line of production code in his life, but he'd worked at 3 major consulting firms and had an impressive collection of buzzwords in his vocabulary. "You'll love working under Derek," Marcus had told me privately over dinner at our favorite restaurant. He'd chosen a public place for this conversation, I realized later, because he knew I wouldn't make a scene. He really understands the business side of technology. You can focus on what you do best, the actual coding, while he handles strategy and client relations. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. I was being demoted in favor of someone who couldn't debug his way out of a paper bag, someone whose idea of technical leadership was scheduling more meetings and creating PowerPoint presentations about synergistic optimization opportunities. "Marcus," I'd said, my voice carefully controlled, "I built this platform. I understand its capabilities and limitations better than anyone. How can you bring in someone who's never even looked at our codebase to make strategic decisions about its future?" Marcus had reached across the table to take my hand, his expression soft with what I now recognize as practiced manipulation. "Sarah, I know this is hard to hear, but you have to understand the bigger picture. Investors don't just fund great technology, they fund great leadership. Derek has experience managing large technical teams at enterprise scale. He's worked with Fortune 500 clients. He speaks their language." "I can learn to speak their language," I'd protested. "Of course you can," Marcus had said, his thumb stroking my knuckles. "And you will eventually. But right now, we need someone who can step in immediately and inspire confidence in our ability to scale. This isn't about your capabilities, it's about market perception." Market perception. As if my gender and age were just unfortunate market conditions to be managed around rather than assets that could differentiate us in an industry desperate for fresh perspectives. The fact that my own boyfriend was demoting me in favor of someone objectively less qualified should have been my wake-up call. Instead, I doubled down, telling myself that this was temporary, that once Derek proved himself incompetent, Marcus would see his mistake and restore my position. I'd worked longer hours, produced better code, and tried to prove my worth through sheer competence. I'd been pathetically grateful when Marcus would occasionally praise my work in team meetings, feeding off those crumbs of validation like a starving person. "Sarah's implementation of the new user analytics dashboard is really impressive," he'd say, and I'd feel a warm flush of pride that disgusted me now in retrospect. I'd been so starved for recognition that even basic acknowledgement of my work felt like a gift. During those 8 months under Derek's leadership, I watched the platform I'd built begin to deteriorate. Derek's idea of technical strategy was to implement every trending buzzword he'd read about in business magazines. He wanted to add blockchain capabilities to our project management system because blockchain is disrupting everything. He insisted we needed to pivot toward artificial intelligence, not understanding that the machine learning systems I'd built were already more sophisticated than anything our competitors offered. Most damaging was his obsession with microservices architecture. Despite my warnings about the complexity it would introduce and the performance overhead it would create, Derek pushed forward with a plan to break apart my elegant, cohesive system into dozens of small, interconnected services. He'd read an article about how Google and Netflix used microservices and decided that TechFlow needed the same approach, regardless of whether it made sense for our specific use case. We need to modernize our approach, he'd announced in a team meeting, using a laser pointer to highlight buzzwords on a slide deck that looked like it had been designed by someone who'd never written code. Monolithic architectures are so 2015. Our clients expect cloud-native, containerized solutions with API-first design principles. I tried to explain that our monolithic architecture was actually a carefully designed modular system that provided better performance and reliability than the distributed mess he was proposing. I'd shown him benchmarks, drawn diagrams, and even built prototypes to demonstrate the performance implications of his proposed changes. Derek had listened with the patient expression of someone humoring a child. "Sarah, I appreciate your attachment to the original design, but you have to think bigger picture. This isn't just about performance. It's about positioning TechFlow as a cutting-edge technology company that enterprise clients can trust with their digital transformation initiatives. But the performance implications can be solved with better DevOps practices and cloud optimization," Derek had interrupted. "We're not constrained by the limitations you're worried about. We have the resources to build a truly scalable solution." I'd looked around the room at my fellow developers, seeing the skepticism in their eyes, but none of them spoke up. Derek was the CTO. Marcus had given him authority over all technical decisions. And I was just a senior developer now, my opinions carrying no more weight than anyone else's. The implementation of Derek's grand vision was a disaster, exactly as I'd predicted. The microservices architecture introduced complexity without providing any meaningful benefits. Services that had been simple function calls now required network requests, introducing latency and potential failure points. The system became harder to debug, harder to monitor, and significantly less reliable. Client complaints started coming in immediately. Response times that had been measured in milliseconds now took seconds. Features that had worked flawlessly for years began failing intermittently due to network timeouts and service discovery issues. The elegant machine learning pipeline I'd built, which had operated seamlessly within the original architecture, became a nightmare of inter-service communication that produced inconsistent results. I'd documented every issue, created detailed reports showing exactly how Derek's changes were degrading system performance, and proposed solutions that could mitigate the damage. But Derek dismissed my concerns as resistance to change and attachment to legacy systems. In team meetings, he'd present my bug reports as evidence that we needed even more sophisticated monitoring and orchestration tools, rather than acknowledgement that his fundamental approach was flawed. "This is exactly why we needed to modernize," he'd tell the room, waving my carefully researched reports like evidence of his own wisdom. The old system was hiding these scalability issues. Now that we've exposed them, we can build proper solutions. Marcus supported Derek completely. When I'd tried to discuss the platform's degrading performance with him privately, he'd been dismissive. "Growing pains," he'd said, not looking up from his laptop. Derek knows what he's doing. These kinds of architectural transitions are always bumpy at first. "Marcus, we're losing clients. The Anderson Group is threatening to break their contract if we don't resolve the performance issues by next month." "Then fix the performance issues," he'd said, finally looking at me with barely concealed irritation. "That's what you're here for, isn't it? Problem solving?" The casual dismissal in his tone was like a physical blow. I was no longer his brilliant girlfriend whose insights he valued. I was staff. A resource to be deployed when problems needed solving, then ignored when strategy was being discussed. But today, sitting in that conference room as Derek presented his roadmap for TechFlow's next phase of expansion, I finally reached my breaking point. His presentation was fundamentally flawed in ways that made my teeth ache. He was proposing to migrate our entire data layer to a new NoSQL database because relational databases don't scale in the cloud era, despite the fact that our current PostgreSQL implementation was handling our load perfectly and had been optimized over years of careful tuning. He wanted to implement a new authentication system using the latest security framework, which would require every existing client to undergo a complex migration process. He was proposing to replace our carefully optimized API with a GraphQL implementation because RESTful APIs are becoming obsolete. Never mind that our clients had built integrations around our existing endpoints, and changing them would break every single one. Most egregiously, he was planning to rewrite the machine learning components I'd built using a trendy new framework that promised no-code AI solutions. He clearly didn't understand that the sophistication of our predictive algorithms was precisely what gave us our competitive advantage, and that replacing them with generic, off-the-shelf solutions would eliminate everything that made TechFlow special. I'd sat through the first half of his presentation in growing horror, watching him systematically propose to destroy every technical advantage we'd built. When he opened the floor for questions, I'd raised my hand immediately. "Derek," I'd said, keeping my voice level and professional, "I have concerns about several of these proposals. The database migration alone would require rebuilding our entire data access layer, which could introduce significant stability risks. And replacing our custom ML algorithms with a generic framework would eliminate the predictive accuracy that our clients rely on." Derek had smiled condescendingly. "Sarah, I understand that change can be uncomfortable, especially when you're deeply invested in legacy systems. But we can't let attachment to existing solutions prevent us from evolving. The frameworks I'm proposing offer much better long-term maintainability and industry support." "But what about performance?" I'd pressed. "Our current systems are highly optimized for our specific use cases. Generic solutions are going to introduce overhead and reduce the accuracy of our predictions." "That's where you're thinking too narrowly," Derek had replied, clicking to a slide full of marketing buzzwords. "Modern cloud platforms give us auto-scaling capabilities that make performance optimization less critical, and the accuracy differences you're worried about are probably negligible compared to the benefits of using industry-standard solutions." I'd felt my professionalism slipping as he dismissed years of careful optimization as negligible. "Derek, I built these systems. I've benchmarked them extensively. The performance characteristics aren't theoretical. They're based on real-world usage patterns from millions of users. And that experience is valuable," Derek had said, his tone growing slightly sharper. "But we can't let perfect be the enemy of good. Sometimes you have to accept that newer solutions, even if they're not quite as optimized, offer better strategic value." That's when I'd started providing specific examples. I'd pulled up performance charts showing exactly how his proposed changes would impact response times. I'd referenced client feedback that specifically praised the accuracy of our predictive features. I'd explained in technical detail why his proposed architecture would create scalability bottlenecks that didn't exist in our current design. Derek had grown increasingly defensive as I dismantled his proposals one by one. Other people in the room had started asking questions, clearly concerned about the implications I was raising. I could see doubt creeping into their expressions as they realized the scope of the changes Derek was proposing and the risks those changes would introduce. That's when Marcus had intervened. "Sarah, I think you're overthinking this," he'd said, his voice carrying that familiar note of patient condescension that I'd learned to dread. "Derek has experience with enterprise-level scaling that, frankly, you don't. These are the kinds of strategic decisions that require a broader perspective than individual technical implementations." The dismissal was casual, automatic, like swatting away an annoying insect. But something about the phrasing, the implication that my technical expertise was somehow narrow and limited, had lit a fire in my chest. "I built the original architecture," I'd replied, my voice still level but with an edge that hadn't been there before. "I understand the limitations and capabilities better than anyone in this room. I've optimized every component for our specific use patterns. I know exactly what these changes will do to our performance and reliability." Marcus had looked at me with what I now recognized as genuine surprise. I hadn't challenged him this directly, this publicly, in months. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Uncertainty, maybe even respect. But then his expression hardened into the cold authority of a CEO who wasn't going to be questioned by a subordinate. That's when he'd closed his laptop with a sharp snap, fixed me with that cutting stare, and delivered the words that would change everything. You're just not good enough, Sarah. Maybe it's time you accepted that and found something more suitable to your capabilities. The silence that followed felt eternal. I could feel the other executives avoiding eye contact, embarrassed witnesses to what felt like a public execution. But in that silence, something remarkable happened. The hurt, the self-doubt, the desperate need for Marcus's approval, it all just evaporated. In its place, a cold, crystalline clarity settled over me like armor. I looked at Marcus, really looked at him, and for the first time in 3 years, I saw him clearly. The carefully styled hair that had once made my heart race now looked like the work of someone trying too hard to project an image. The confident smile that had once charmed me revealed itself as the smirk of a man who'd built his empire on the backs of others while convincing them they should be grateful for the opportunity. This wasn't the brilliant visionary I'd fallen in love with. This was a small, insecure person who'd stolen my work, undermined my confidence, and convinced me I was lucky to be in his orbit. This was someone who'd systematically erased my contributions to make himself look more impressive, who'd diminished my achievements to inflate his own ego. "You know what?" I'd said, my voice surprisingly steady. "You're absolutely right." Marcus had blinked, clearly expecting tears or protests, or the kind of emotional breakdown that would let him dismiss me as too sensitive or unable to handle criticism. Around the table, the other executives had looked up, sensing a shift in the atmosphere that they couldn't quite identify. "I'm not good enough," I'd continued, standing slowly and gathering my materials with deliberate calm. "Not good enough to work for someone who doesn't value my contributions. Not good enough to stay in a relationship where I'm treated like an intern who should be grateful for any recognition. And definitely not good enough to waste another minute of my life trying to prove myself to people who've already decided I'm beneath them." I'd picked up my laptop and headed for the door, Marcus's voice following me with that note of panic that suggested he was beginning to realize he'd miscalculated. "Sarah, don't be dramatic. We can discuss this later." I turned back, my hand on the door handle, and looked at him one last time. "No, Marcus, we really can't." The walk to my desk felt like moving through water. My colleagues watched with the horrified fascination of people witnessing a car accident, unsure whether to intervene or look away. I'd packed my personal items methodically. The MIT coffee mug my advisor had given me, the small succulent I'd bought to brighten my workspace, the few technical books I'd brought from home. Everything else belonged to tech flow, including 3 years of my code, my innovations, and my intellectual property. Marcus had followed me, his voice dropping to the intimate tone he used when he wanted to be persuasive. "Sarah, come on. You're upset, I get it. But we're a team. We can work through this." I'd looked at him standing beside my desk, watching me pack, and felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no hurt, no lingering affection, just a mild curiosity about how I'd ever found him attractive, how I'd ever believed his words over my own instincts. "We were never a team, Marcus," I'd said quietly, closing my laptop bag. "Teams share credit and decision-making authority. What we had was you taking credit for my work while convincing me I should be grateful for the opportunity." That night, I'd sat in the spare bedroom of my friend Lisa's apartment. I'd moved out of Marcus's penthouse that very evening, taking only what was actually mine, and made a list. Not a list of grievances or hurt feelings, but a strategic assessment of everything I knew about TechFlow Solutions, its weaknesses, its dependencies, and most importantly, its vulnerabilities. I knew the code base better than anyone because I'd written most of it. I knew which shortcuts Derek would inevitably take because he'd already started taking them. I knew the company's client pain points because I'd been the one fixing the problems for 2 years while Derek took credit for the solutions. I knew exactly which technical decisions would cause problems down the line because I'd been documenting the risks that nobody wanted to hear about. And I knew something else that Marcus had never bothered to learn. I came from money. My parents had been MIT professors, brilliant academics, who'd also been savvy enough to invest early in the companies their graduate students were founding. They'd watched the tech boom of the 90s from the inside, backing the right startups and making strategic investments that most academics would never have considered. When they died in a car accident during my junior year, I'd inherited not just their intellectual legacy, but a trust fund worth $37 million. I'd never touched it, too proud to rely on anything I hadn't earned myself. The fund had just been sitting there, growing through careful investments managed by my parents' financial advisor, while I'd built my career through pure merit. But as I'd sat there in Lisa's spare room, drafting my resignation letter, I'd realized that pride had been another form of self-imposed limitation. The next morning, I'd submitted my resignation via email, effective immediately. Marcus had called within minutes, his tone shifting between confusion and anger as he'd processed what was happening. "You can't just quit," he'd said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "We have deadlines. You have responsibilities. The Anderson Group migration is scheduled for next week." "To whom?" I'd asked calmly. "You've made it clear I'm not good enough to meet them anyway." "Sarah, you're being childish. Come back and we'll talk about a raise, maybe a promotion. We can work out a better title, more recognition." I'd hung up on him mid-sentence. Over the next 3 months, I'd watched TechFlow's technical infrastructure begin to crumble from the outside. It was almost exactly as I'd predicted. Without me there to maintain the core systems and patch the subtle issues that cropped up in complex software, Derek's inexperience had become glaringly obvious. Critical bugs went unfixed because he didn't understand the codebase well enough to identify root causes. Server performance degraded because he'd implemented his microservices architecture without understanding the performance implications. The machine learning optimization that had been our competitive advantage started producing erratic results because no one understood how to maintain the neural networks I'd built. The Anderson Group had terminated their contract after the migration I'd designed was botched by Derek's team. 3 other major clients had followed suit, citing performance issues and reliability problems. Industry blogs that had once praised TechFlow's technical sophistication were now running articles about the company's scaling challenges and technical debt. Meanwhile, I'd been busy. Using contacts from my MIT network and the broader tech community, I'd quietly assembled a team of the best developers and business strategists I could find. Not just technically competent people, but individuals who'd been overlooked or undervalued by the traditional tech hierarchy. Brilliant women whose ideas had been dismissed, innovative minorities who'd been passed over for promotion, younger developers whose fresh perspectives had been ignored by older managers. My company, which I called Streamline Systems, operated in stealth mode for those 3 months. We'd developed a project management platform that solved every major problem I'd identified with TechFlow's architecture. More importantly, we'd done it without the technical debt and scaling limitations that Derek's leadership was building into our old platform. But building a better product was only part of my strategy. I'd spent years watching Marcus charm investors and clients, learning the language of boardrooms and the psychology of business relationships. Now I'd used that knowledge systematically, reaching out to TechFlow's most frustrated clients with a simple message. "I understand your pain points because I built the system you're struggling with. Let me show you something better." The response was overwhelming. Companies that had been considering leaving TechFlow signed preliminary agreements with Streamline before we'd even officially launched. But I wasn't ready to go public yet. I needed one more element to fall into place. TechFlow's quarterly board meeting was scheduled for 6 months after I'd left. Through my network, and Marcus had no idea how extensive my network actually was, I'd learned that the company was hemorrhaging money. Technical problems were causing client defections. Derek's ambitious roadmap had resulted in a bloated, unstable system that crashed regularly. The board was getting nervous about their investment. That's when I'd made my move. I'd discovered that TechFlow's largest investor, Meridian Capital, was facing their own challenges. Several of their portfolio companies had failed in the past year, and they needed a win to maintain their reputation with their own investors. Through a mutual contact, my parents' former financial advisor had connections throughout the Seattle investment community. I'd arranged a meeting with James Morrison, Meridian's managing partner. "Miss Chen," he'd said, as I'd entered his corner office, clearly expecting someone else. "I was told I was meeting with the CEO of Streamline Systems. You are, I'd replied, settling into the chair across from his desk with the calm confidence I'd learned from watching Marcus navigate similar meetings. And I have a proposition that could solve both our problems. I'd spent the next hour laying out my case with the methodical precision of a master chess player executing a long planned strategy. Streamline had better technology, stronger client relationships, and a management team with a proven track record. TechFlow had market position and an established user base, but was being driven into the ground by incompetent leadership. Meridian could either watch their investment crumble, or they could facilitate a strategic acquisition that would salvage their position while eliminating a growing liability. You want to buy TechFlow, Morrison had said slowly, his experienced investor's mind processing the implications. I want to save it, I'd corrected, and I want you to make money in the process. The beauty of my proposal was its elegant simplicity. Meridian would pressure TechFlow's board to accept a buyout offer, citing the company's declining performance and mounting technical debt. Streamline would acquire TechFlow for a fraction of its peak valuation, but still enough for investors to avoid a total loss. The combined company would have better technology, a larger client base, and, most importantly, competent leadership. Morrison had been interested but cautious. What makes you think you can succeed where Marcus Chen failed? I'd smiled with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where all the bodies were buried. Because I built the foundation he's been standing on, and I know exactly where the cracks are. 2 weeks later, Morrison had called Marcus to schedule an urgent board meeting. The agenda was simple: either accept Streamline's acquisition offer or face the consequences of Meridian pulling their support. With the company already struggling and other investors growing nervous, the board had quickly fallen in line. Marcus had called me the night before the meeting, his voice strained with a desperation I'd never heard before. Sarah, what the hell are you doing? He'd sounded genuinely bewildered, as if he couldn't understand how his former girlfriend had suddenly become a threat to everything he'd built. This is insane. You can't destroy everything we built together? We didn't build anything together, Marcus, I'd said, my voice calm and steady. I built something and you took credit for it. Now I'm taking it back. I'll fight this, he'd said, his tone shifting to the kind of aggressive bluster he used when he felt cornered. I'll make sure you never work in this industry again. I have connections, influence. With what influence? I'd asked, genuinely curious. Your company is failing, your investors are abandoning you, and your clients are already signing with us. What exactly are you going to fight me with? The silence on the other end had told me everything I needed to know. The acquisition meeting had taken place in the same conference room where Marcus had declared me not good enough 6 months earlier. This time, I'd sat at the head of the table, flanked by my legal team and my new COO, a brilliant woman named Janet Kim, who'd been passed over for promotion at 3 different tech companies because she wasn't aggressive enough. Marcus had sat at the far end, Derek beside him, both of them looking like they were attending their own funeral, which, in a professional sense, they were. Morrison had presented the terms efficiently. Streamline would acquire TechFlow for $42 million, less than the company's peak valuation, but more than its current worth. Given the technical problems and client defections, existing employees would be evaluated for retention based on their skills and contributions. Current management would be restructured. This is a hostile takeover, Marcus had said, his voice shaking with a mixture of rage and disbelief. You're using insider knowledge to destroy a company you helped build. I'd looked at him across the table, remembering the man I'd once thought I loved, and felt nothing but a mild curiosity about why I'd ever found him attractive. No, Marcus, I'd said quietly. This is a rescue operation. I'm saving the company from the people who were destroying it. The vote had been unanimous among the investors. TechFlow Solutions was now a subsidiary of Streamline Systems. As the lawyers had shuffled papers and discussed transition timelines, Marcus had stood abruptly. We need to talk, he'd said, staring at me with a mixture of fury and disbelief. No, I'd replied, not looking up from the documents I was reviewing. We don't. But he'd persisted, following me out of the conference room when the meeting ended. In the hallway, away from the lawyers and investors, he'd grabbed my arm with the kind of desperate aggression of someone watching their world collapse. Sarah, please, can't we work this out? We were good together. We can be good together again. I'd looked down at his hand on my arm, then back at his face. This close, I could see the desperation in his eyes. The way his carefully maintained confidence had cracked to reveal the scared, small person underneath. Marcus, I'd said, gently removing his hand with the calm detachment I'd learned to cultivate. I need you to understand something. This isn't about revenge. This isn't about hurt feelings or getting back at you for what you did to me. This is about business. And in business, you keep the assets that add value and eliminate the liabilities that don't. His face had gone pale as the implications sank in. You're firing me. I'm restructuring the company to optimize performance. Your position has been made redundant. I founded this company. No, I'd said, my voice steady and final. You put your name on the company I built. There's a difference. I'd turned to walk away, but his voice had stopped me one more time. I loved you, Sarah. I still love you. For a moment, I'd almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then I'd remembered 3 years of condescension, of stolen credit, of being made to feel small and grateful for scraps of recognition. No, Marcus, I'd said without turning around. You loved having someone to diminish so you could feel bigger. You loved having someone brilliant enough to make you look good, but insecure enough not to challenge you. You never loved me. You loved what I could do for you. 6 months later, I'd stood in the same conference room, now redecorated and bearing the Streamline Systems logo, addressing our quarterly all-hands meeting. The room was packed with employees, some inherited from TechFlow, others recruited from my network. Under Janet's leadership, we'd not only stabilized the platform, but had launched 3 new features that were revolutionizing the project management space. This quarter, we've exceeded our growth targets by 40%, I'd announced to enthusiastic applause. Client satisfaction is at an all-time high, and we've been approached by 5 major enterprise clients interested in custom implementations. After the meeting, as employees had filtered out chatting excitedly about bonuses and upcoming projects, Janet had approached me. Derek's been calling again, she'd said quietly. 3rd time this week. He wants to know if we're hiring. I'd almost laughed. Derek, like Marcus, had struggled to find new positions after word had spread about TechFlow's technical failures under their leadership. The tech industry, for all its talk of innovation and disruption, was still a small community where reputations mattered. What did you tell him? That we only hire competent people, Janet had replied with a slight smile. That evening, I'd returned to my new apartment, a sleek downtown loft that I'd bought with my first year's profits, not my trust fund, and found a letter slipped under my door. I'd recognized Marcus's handwriting immediately. Inside was a single page covered in his familiar scrawl. Asterisk Sarah, I know you probably won't read this, but I had to try one more time. I've been thinking about what you said, about how I never really loved you, and I think you might be right. I think I was so focused on proving I was smart enough, successful enough, worthy enough, that I couldn't see what I was doing to you. I know it's too late for us. I know I destroyed any chance we had when I chose my ego over our partnership. But I want you to know that watching you build Streamline, seeing you succeed without me, has made me realize who you really are. You were always the brilliant one. You were always the one with the vision and the skills to make it real. I was just too insecure to admit it. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect anything. But I needed you to know that I finally understand what I lost. I hope you're happy. I hope you find someone who sees your worth from the beginning, who builds you up instead of tearing you down. You deserve that and so much more. Marcus Asterisk. I'd read the letter twice, then walked to my kitchen and dropped it in the trash. Not out of anger or spite, but out of simple indifference. His words, his regret, his newfound understanding, none of it mattered anymore. I'd moved on to a life where my worth wasn't determined by his approval or anyone else's. A year later, Streamline Systems was acquired by a tech giant for $200 million. I'd retained a controlling interest and the CEO position, but the acquisition had given us the resources to expand globally. The announcement had made the front page of TechCrunch, with a photo of me ringing the opening bell at the New York Stock Exchange. The article had mentioned TechFlow's original founders only briefly in a sidebar about failed acquisitions in the project management space. Marcus and Derek had both taken positions at a mid-tier consulting firm their startup dreams effectively over. I hadn't felt vindicated or triumphant reading about their struggles. I'd felt nothing at all, and that absence of feeling was perhaps the greatest victory of all. They no longer had the power to hurt me because I no longer gave them permission to matter. Instead, my attention was focused on the future. Janet had been promoted to president, and together we were planning Streamline's expansion into artificial intelligence and machine learning, areas where my technical background gave us a significant advantage. We'd also launched a mentorship program for young women in tech, providing the kind of support and validation I'd wished for during my years at TechFlow. The irony wasn't lost on me that Marcus's greatest insult, telling me I wasn't good enough, had become the catalyst for me discovering just how good I actually was. His attempt to diminish me had forced me to stop seeking external validation and start trusting my own abilities. In trying to keep me small, he'd inadvertently set me free. On the day the acquisition was finalized, I'd received a text from an unknown number. When I'd opened it, I'd seen Marcus's name and a simple message. "Congratulations, you were always too good for me." I'd stared at the message for a moment, then deleted it without responding. He was right, of course, but not in the way he meant. I hadn't been too good for him. I'd been too good to let anyone make me feel unworthy of success. That evening, I'd celebrated with my team at a rooftop restaurant overlooking the Seattle skyline. As I'd raised my glass to toast our success, I'd caught sight of TechFlow's old building in the distance, now housing a different startup with different dreams. Somewhere in the city, Marcus was probably going to bed in a studio apartment, wondering how his life had gone so wrong. But I wasn't thinking about him. I was thinking about the brilliant young developers on my team, the revolutionary products we were building, and the future we were creating together. I was thinking about the woman I'd become, not despite the obstacles I'd faced, but because of how I'd chosen to overcome them. Marcus had been wrong about many things, but he'd been absolutely right about one. I wasn't good enough. I was better than good enough. I was extraordinary. And the most beautiful part was that I no longer needed anyone else to tell me so. As I'd looked out over the city lights, Janet had appeared beside me. "Penny for your thoughts?" I'd smiled, turning away from the window and back to the celebration. "Just thinking about how sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the best thing that could have happened." "Any regrets?" she'd asked. I'd considered the question seriously. Did I regret the 3 years I'd spent letting Marcus diminish me? Did I regret not seeing his true nature sooner? Did I regret the pain and self-doubt I'd endured? "No," I'd said finally. "No regrets. Everything that happened made me who I am today. And I like who I am today." Janet had clinked her glass against mine. "To being more than good enough. To being exactly enough," I'd corrected, "all by ourselves." As the night had worn on and the celebration continued around me, I'd felt a deep sense of peace settle over me. This wasn't the end of my story, it was barely the beginning, but it was the end of the chapter where I let other people define my worth, where I sought validation from those who were threatened by my success. Marcus had said I wasn't good enough, and in a way, he'd been right.